They say the Alpha King's bed is a graveyard, Ivana whispered, her voice like grinding glass in the dimly lit corridor. No woman survives his chambers. They go in wearing silk and come out in shrouds. Astrid scrubbed the freezing stone floor, her bruised knees aching. Then why do they keep going in? She asked softly. Ivana sneered, her eyes gleaming with cold malice. Because every fool thinks she is the exception to the monster. But Soren Bjornsson has no heart to win. Remember that, little bird. Before you clean his hearth tonight. The fortress of Oakhaven stood as a jagged black tooth against the bleeding winter sky. It was a place where warmth went to die, ruled by a man who had long forgotten the meaning of the word. Soren Bjornsson, the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, was a myth carved from ice and violence. He was not a man who governed through diplomacy. He ruled through the visceral, paralyzing fear that his lichen blood inspired. His reign was a brutal necessity in a world governed by fangs and claws, but it had stripped him of his humanity. Within the castle's towering stone walls, the servants moved like ghosts, their heads bowed, their footsteps silent. To draw the king's attention was to invite death. The rumors that clung to him were not mere servant gossip. They were undeniable facts documented in blood. Noble houses from across the continent had sent their most beautiful daughters, their most cunning assassins, and their most enchanting spies to his chambers. Some sought to seduce him, to become the Queen of the North. Others sought to slide a poisoned dagger between his ribs while he slept. None survived. Soren possessed a primal instinct that could smell deception before it even entered his domain. He trusted no one, and his paranoia was matched only by his lethality. Among the invisible shadows of Oakhaven was Astrid Nygaard. She was a maid of no significance, a girl whose existence was defined by the relentless cycle of ash, water, and lie. With hair the color of pale wheat and eyes like the tempestuous gray sea, Astrid possessed a quiet, fragile beauty that she went to great lengths to hide. Survival in Oakhaven meant blending into the masonry. She kept her face smudged with soot and her gaze fixed firmly on her worn leather boots. Astrid reported to Ivana Stankovic, the head maid. Ivana was a formidable woman, with sharp, aristocratic features and a temperament like a cornered viper. She ruled the servant quarters with an iron fist, dispensing punishments with a cruel, unpredictable delight. Most believed Ivana harbored a secret, obsessive love for the Alpha King, and that her cruelty stemmed from bitter jealousy toward any woman who crossed his path. On the eve of the winter solstice, the castle was a hive of frantic, terrified energy. Soren had just returned from the jagged borderlands, having crushed a rebellion led by rogue packs. He returned not with a triumphant procession, but in a storm of fury and blood. He had bypassed the Great Hall, storming directly into his private chambers in the high tower, leaving a trail of crimson on the marble floors. Petr Dmitrovic, the king's beta and most trusted advisor, stood at the base of the tower. Petr was a man of quiet authority, his silver-streaked hair and warm paternal eyes a stark contrast to the king's terrifying aura. Petr had always been kind to the servants, often slipping them extra rations or offering a gentle smile. "The king is wounded," Petr announced to the trembling line of servants. His voice was grave, laden with a heavy sorrow. "He refuses the healers. His beast is close to the surface, and he trusts no one with a blade near his flesh." Ivana stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "His chambers must be cleaned. The blood will set into the stone. Whoever goes up there," Petr warned, his gaze sweeping over the terrified maids, "must be silent. He is volatile. One wrong move, one scent of fear that he misinterprets as guilt, and he will tear you apart." Ivana's sharp gaze landed on Astrid. The young maid had been working for 3 days straight, her body trembling with sheer exhaustion, kept awake only by the biting cold and Ivana's threats. "Astrid," Ivana barked, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "Fetch the hot water, the bandages, and the lye. You will clean the king's chambers." A collective gasp rippled through the servants. It was a death sentence. To enter the wounded beast's den was suicide. Petr frowned, stepping toward Ivana. "She is but a girl, Ivana. Send someone with more experience. Send someone who will not panic." "She is invisible," Ivana countered, her eyes flashing with a strange, undecipherable emotion. "She makes no noise. The king despises noise. Go, Astrid, and pray the gods are merciful, because our king is not." Astrid's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her hands shook violently as she gathered the heavy wooden buckets. She didn't look at Pitar's sympathetic face or Ivana's cold stare. She only looked at the winding, shadowy staircase that led to the top of the tower. She was so deeply, bone-achingly exhausted that the fear of death was almost rivaled by the desperate yearning for rest. Every step up the spiraling staircase felt like a mountain. The air grew thicker, heavier, saturated with the coppery, metallic tang of blood and the sharp, dominating scent of pine and raw ozone, the Alpha King's signature scent. When she finally reached the heavy oak doors, they were slightly ajar. The silence emanating from within was not peaceful. It was the suffocating silence of a predator waiting in the dark. Astrid swallowed the lump in her throat, her knuckles white as she gripped the buckets, and pushed the door open. She was stepping into the graveyard, and she was certain she would not walk out. The king's chamber was massive, a cavernous space of dark wood, furs, and imposing stone. A massive hearth dominated the far wall, though the fire had died down to glowing, resentful embers. The wind howled against the thick glass of the windows, rattling the panes like desperate ghosts begging for entry. And there, in the center of the room, sat the monster. Soren Bjornsson was slumped in a massive chair carved from black ironwood. He was a mountain of a man, his broad shoulders rising and falling with heavy, labored breaths. His shirt was torn to shreds, revealing a torso mapped with a lifetime of violent scars. But it was the fresh wound that caught Astrid's terrified eye, a deep, jagged laceration across his ribcage that oozed dark, thick blood. His head was thrown back, his eyes closed. His face, usually a mask of stoic cruelty, was drawn tight with pain. He looked less like a king, and more like a wounded god, fallen from the sky and left to bleed out in the dark. Astrid stood frozen by the door, the heavy buckets dragging her arms downward. She waited for him to snap awake, for his golden lichen eyes to lock onto her, for the inevitable roar that would precede her death. But he didn't move. The only sound was the ragged rasp of his breathing and the drip, drip, drip of his blood hitting the floorboards. Slowly, carefully, Astrid moved. She didn't let her boots scrape the floor. She approached the hearth first, her movements practiced and fluid. She stoked the embers, added fresh logs, and coaxed a warm, golden fire to life. The flickering light cast long, dancing shadows across the room, illuminating the sheer scale of the king's injury. She turned to face him. The blood was pooling beneath his chair. Ivana's orders echoed in her mind. Clean the floors. But as she knelt with her rag and bucket, a strange, overwhelming compulsion seized her. It wasn't bravery. It was a profound, instinctual empathy. She had spent her entire life tending to the broken things of this castle, fixing torn tapestries, mending cracked pottery, nursing sick hounds. She could not simply scrub the floor while a man bled to death above her, monster or not. Trembling, Astrid wrung out a clean cloth in the steaming water. She crept closer to the massive chair. Up close, his sheer size was overwhelming. The heat radiating off his skin was like a furnace. She hesitated, her hand hovering inches from his chest. If he woke now, he would kill her instantly. With a soft, terrified exhale, she pressed the hot, damp cloth against the jagged wound. Soren flinched. A low, rumbling growl vibrated deep within his chest, a sound that resonated through Astrid's very bones. She froze, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the end. But his eyes didn't open. The growl subsided into a heavy sigh. The heat of the cloth seemed to ease the seizing muscles of his chest. Astrid let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. For the next hour, she worked in silence. She cleaned the wound, her small hands moving with surprising gentleness over the lethal muscle and scarred tissue. She applied a thick layer of yarrow salve she kept in her apron for her own blistered hands, and firmly bound his ribs with the clean linen bandages she had brought. Through it all, the king remained unconscious, his body finally succumbing to the trauma of the battle and the warmth of the roaring fire. When the binding was secure, Astrid stepped back. The adrenaline that had kept her moving suddenly vanished, leaving behind a profound, crushing emptiness. She had been awake for nearly 2 days, scrubbing the great hall, preparing the kitchens, and now, tending to the Alpha King. Her legs felt like lead. Her vision swam with dark, dizzying spots. She needed to leave. She needed to pick up her buckets and disappear back into the shadows before he awoke. She took a step backward, but her foot caught on the heavy wolf fur rug. Her exhausted body simply gave out. Her knees buckled, and she fell forward. She didn't hit the hard stone floor. She collapsed right against the side of the massive ironwood chair, her upper body falling across Soren's lap, her head coming to rest squarely against his broad, bare chest, just above the fresh bandages. Panic spiked through her fading consciousness. "Move," her brain screamed. "Get up! He will kill you." But her muscles refused to obey. The warmth radiating from his body was intoxicating. The slow, rhythmic, impossibly deep thud of his heart beneath her ear was like a heavy drum lulling her into the abyss. It was the safest, warmest place she had felt in her entire wretched life. Just for a second, she thought, her eyelids fluttering shut. Just for one heartbeat, the scent of pine, ozone, and warm skin enveloped her. Astrid Nygaard, a lowly maid in the house of the deadliest predator in the world, went completely limp, slipping into a deep, dreamless sleep on the chest of the Alpha King. Soren awoke to the sensation of a trap springing shut. His eyes snapped open, blazing with a feral golden light. His muscles coiled, his lichen instincts roaring to the surface, ready to sever the throat of the assassin who had finally breached his defenses. His hand, heavy and lethal, shot upward, fingers curling into claws, ready to crush the skull of the weight resting against his chest, but his hand stopped midair. His heightened senses, primed for the sharp reek of deception, the metallic tang of poison, or the cold sweat of fear, encountered none of those things. Instead, his nose was filled with the delicate scent of crushed lavender, lye soap, and the crisp, clean smell of winter air. Soren slowly lowered his gaze, his glowing eyes narrowing in sheer disbelief. There was a woman draped across him, a small, incredibly fragile-looking girl in the coarse, drab uniform of a scullery maid. Her face was turned inward, pressed against his heart. Her breathing was slow, even, and deep. She was completely, undeniably asleep. For a long moment, the Alpha King simply stared. His mind, trained for war and betrayal, struggled to process the absurdity of the scene. Women came to his room to kill him, or to perform elaborate, seductive masquerades to gain his favor. None of them, absolutely none of them, came to his room, bandaged his wounds, and then used him as a mattress. He felt the tight, clean linen wrapped expertly around his ribs. The throbbing pain had dulled significantly. She had tended to him. Soren's claws retracted into human fingertips. He looked at her pale face, noting the dark, purple shadows of exhaustion beneath her eyes, the soot smudged on her cheek, the chapped, blistered skin of her small hands resting against his arm. She was utterly defenseless. He could kill her with a single flick of his wrist. It was the rule. It was the law of his survival. No one gets this close. He raised his hand again, hovering over her delicate neck. But as his fingers brushed the soft hairs at the nape of her neck, her body shifted. She let out a soft, contented sigh and snuggled closer into his warmth, completely oblivious to the apex predator whose claws were inches from her spine. Soren froze. A strange, unfamiliar tremor echoed in his chest. It wasn't rage. It wasn't lust. It was something entirely foreign. A crack in the ice. The heavy oak door suddenly creaked open. Soren's golden eyes snapped toward the entrance, lethal and cold. Peter Dmitrovic stood in the doorway, a silver tray of tonics in his hands. The beta's warm eyes widened in absolute shock. The tray slipped from his grip, crashing to the stone floor with a deafening clatter. The sound shattered the silence. Astrid jolted awake with a violent gasp. Disorientation gave way to stark, blinding terror as she realized where she was, who she was touching, and what she had done. She scrambled backward, her boots slipping on the rug, until her back slammed hard against the stone wall. She pulled her knees to her chest, trembling so violently her teeth chattered. I am sorry, she stammered, her voice a breathless, broken whisper. Tears of pure terror spilled down her cheeks. I am so sorry. I was so tired. Please, Your Grace. Please. Petar stepped into the room, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. His usually kind face was tight with protocol. My king, I apologize for the intrusion. Shall I take the girl to the dungeons? I will execute her myself for this insolence. Astrid squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the king to give the order. She knew the stories. She was already dead. Soren slowly pushed himself up in his chair. The firelight caught the harsh angles of his face, making him look every bit the demon the stories claimed. He looked at Petar, then at the terrified, weeping maid cowering against his wall. She bandaged my wound, Soren said. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the room. She touched you while you slept, my king, Petar countered, stepping forward. She breached your personal space. It is a violation of the highest decree. She must be made an example of, lest the others think your guard is down. Soren's golden gaze locked onto Petar. The air in the room suddenly grew unbearably heavy with the Alpha's crushing dominance. Petar stiffened, taking a small step back. Are you dictating my laws to me, Petar? Soren asked softly, the threat palpable. No, my king. Petar bowed his head swiftly. I only seek to protect you. Soren turned his attention back to Astrid. She looked like a cornered rabbit, expecting the jaws of the wolf to snap shut. He stood up, towering over the room. He walked slowly toward her, his bare feet silent on the stone. Astrid pressed herself harder into the wall, whimpering softly. Soren stopped inches from her. He reached down. Astrid flinched, preparing for the blow. But instead, his massive, calloused hand gently grasped her chin, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. His golden eyes were ancient, unfathomable. He searched her face, looking for the lie, looking for the assassin's glint. He found nothing but sheer, unadulterated innocence. What is your name? He rumbled. Astrid. She choked out. Soren dropped his hand. He looked back at Petar, his voice ringing with absolute, unquestionable authority. Astrid is no longer a scullery maid. She will remain in these chambers. She is to be my personal attendant, and mine alone. No one else is permitted to enter this wing without my express permission. Petar's jaw tightened, a flash of something unpredictable, something dark, crossing his usually warm eyes before he masked it with a bow. As you command, my king. As Petar left, closing the door behind him, Astrid stared up at the giant standing before her. She had survived the king's bedchamber, but as she looked into Soren's unreadable eyes, she realized she was no longer a maid. She was a prisoner in the monster's keep. Within a fortnight, the dynamic of Oakhaven Castle had irrevocably shifted. The rumor spread like wildfire. The Alpha King had kept a woman alive in his chambers. Not a noblewoman, not a courtesan, but a dirt-smudged servant. Astrid's new life was a gilded cage. Soren provided her with warm clothes simple, but infinitely finer than the rags she was used to, and she ate the same food he did. Her duties were minimal: stoking the fire, pouring his wine, and reading to him from ancient texts while he recovered. He rarely spoke to her, but his eyes followed her every movement. It wasn't the gaze of a predator waiting to strike. It was the intense, calculating gaze of a man studying a puzzle he couldn't solve. He found himself inexplicably grounded by her presence. Her scent calmed the restless, violent beast within him. But outside the heavy oak doors, the court was boiling with dangerous intrigue. The winter summit had arrived. Lords and alphas from neighboring territories descended upon Oakhaven to pledge fealty and negotiate borders. Among them was Qasim Rahman, the formidable Alpha King of the southern dunes. Qasim was a striking man, with dark, golden skin, dressed in rich silks, and accompanied by a massive desert cat that stalked by his side. Qasim was known to be a ruthless opportunist. Many whispered that he was only here to gauge Soren's weakness after the recent rebellion. By Qasim's side was Layla Ferrucci, his seer and consort. Layla moved like water, her eyes covered by a veil of sheer silver silk, for she had been blinded by a vision in her youth. Despite her lack of sight, she saw the world with terrifying clarity. During the grand banquet, Astrid stood quietly in the shadows behind Soren's massive throne. The great hall was filled with the sounds of feasting and tense, veiled political jabs. Ivana Stankovic moved through the hall, directing the servants. When her eyes landed on Astrid, they burned with a raw, undeniable fury. Astrid had usurped the position Ivana believed was rightfully hers. Yet, strangely, when a drunken northern lord stumbled too close to Astrid, raising a hand to touch her hair, Ivana casually stepped between them, accidentally spilling scalding wine on the lord's boots, driving him away. Astrid watched, entirely bewildered by the headmaid's unpredictable protection. Across the hall, Qasim raised a golden goblet. "To your health, King Soren," Qasim called out, his voice smooth but laden with challenge. "I hear you suffered a scratch in the borderlands. It is good to see the great wolf of the north is not so easily felled. Soren's eyes narrowed, a low rumble echoing in his chest. It takes more than rogue dogs to fell a wolf, Qasim. Enjoy my wine and keep your eyes on your own borders. As the tension crackled, Layla Ferrucci turned her veiled face directly toward the shadows where Astrid stood. The seer tilted her head, a soft, enigmatic smile gracing her lips. Later that evening, as Astrid navigated the quiet corridors to fetch fresh water, a delicate hand gripped her wrist. Astrid gasped, turning to see Layla. "The wolf is chained by a thread of linen," Layla whispered, her voice like wind chimes. I don't understand, my lady," Astrid stammered. Layla stepped closer, her blind eyes seeming to pierce right through Astrid's soul. "You think you are the prey, little bird, but you are the anchor. Beware the smiling father. The knife in the dark is held by the hand that feeds." Before Astrid could process the cryptic warning, Layla vanished down the corridor. Shaken, Astrid hurried back toward the tower, but as she rounded a dark corner, a large hand clamped over her mouth, dragging her into an alcove. She struggled wildly, terror seizing her, until the familiar scent of old parchment and tobacco hit her. It was Peter. He removed his hand from her mouth but kept her pinned against the stone, his face inches from hers. The warm, paternal kindness in his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, desperate fanaticism. "Listen to me very carefully, Astrid," Petar hissed. "The king is weak. His mind is clouded by whatever spell you have cast on him. The lords see it. Qasim sees it. He is going to lead this kingdom to ruin. He is your king," Astrid whispered fiercely, shocking herself with her own defiance. Petar sneered. "He is a monster who has outlived his usefulness. I have served this realm for 30 years. I will not watch it burn because he has developed a sudden, pathetic attachment to a scullery maid." Petar reached into his cloak and pulled out a small, black vial. He pressed it into Astrid's trembling hand. "Tomorrow night, put this in his wine. It is tasteless, odorless. He will simply fall asleep and not wake up. Do this, and I will give you a bag of gold heavy enough to buy a ship to the Eastern Isles. Refuse, and I will have you tortured and thrown from the highest parapet before the sun rises. You are a maid, Astrid. Do not play at being a queen." Petar released her, melting back into the shadows. Astrid stood in the freezing alcove, the black vial burning like a hot coal in her palm. The court of vipers had finally struck, and she was caught in the center of their venom. The atmosphere in the king's chambers was suffocating. Outside, the blizzard howled, but inside, the silence was more violent. Soren stood by the window, his massive hands clasped behind his back, fully healed yet more ominous than ever. Astrid stood by the table, the silver carafe of wine shaking in her hands. Beside it sat the black vial. Peter's threats, torture, death. The cold parapet screamed in her mind. She could pour it. She could be free, but she looked at Soren and remembered his touch, the way he had seen her when the rest of the world made her invisible. She made her choice. She poured the wine but left the vial untouched. As she brought the goblet to him, Soren turned. He didn't take the cup. Instead, he reached out, his large fingers gently tucking a stray lock of her pale hair behind her ear. The tenderness in his golden eyes shattered her resolve. "You are trembling," he murmured. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She set the goblet down with a sharp clatter. "You must not drink it," she choked out, slamming the black vial onto the table. "It's poison." "Petar, he said you were weak. He threatened to kill me if I didn't do it." The temperature in the room plummeted. The human man vanished, and the Alpha King took his place. Soren's jaw clenched, his muscles tightening like coiled springs. Astrid shrank back, terrified of his brewing storm, but instead of striking her, Soren pulled her into a fierce, protective embrace. "You saved me again, Astrid," he whispered into her hair, his voice vibrating with a deadly intent. He pulled back, his eyes burning with an unpredictable light. He didn't roar. He smiled. It was a cold, terrifying expression that promised blood. He walked to the mantel and drew a massive broadsword. "Petter thinks the wolf is asleep," Soren said quietly. "Tonight, little bird, we leave the door unlocked. Let them come into the dark." The castle was draped in the suffocating silence of the witching hour. Astrid sat huddled in the corner of the king's chamber, hidden behind a heavy velvet tapestry. Her heart beat so fast she felt lightheaded. Soren sat in his ironwood chair, exactly where he had been the night she fell asleep on him. He appeared to be sound asleep, a half-empty goblet of wine resting on the table beside him. The fire had been allowed to die down to a faint, deceptive glow. The heavy oak door creaked. The sound was microscopic, but in the silence, it was deafening. Shadows slipped into the room. 4 men, their faces masked in black cloth, holding wicked curved daggers. Behind them stepped Peter Dmitrovich, his face a mask of grim determination. He looked at the unmoving form of the king, and a sigh of relief escaped his lips. The poison had worked. Do it quickly. Peter whispered to the assassins. Sever the head. I want no chance of the lichen healing. The assassins moved forward, raising their blades in the dim light. Soren's eyes snapped open. They didn't just glow. They burned like miniature suns. Before the lead assassin could swing, Soren exploded from the chair. The sheer speed and violence of his movement defied human physics. He didn't bother drawing a weapon. He was the weapon, with a guttural, terrifying roar that shook the very foundations of the tower. Soren lunged. His hand closed around the first assassin's throat, lifting the grown man off the floor with one arm before hurling him through the thick glass of the window. The shattering glass and the man's fading scream pierced the blizzard. The trap was sprung. The remaining 3 assassins hesitated, sheer panic stalling their blades. That hesitation was fatal. Soren moved through them like a scythe through wheat. It was a brutal, cinematic display of primal power. He disarmed the second assassin, using the man's own momentum to shatter his arm, before throwing him against the stone wall with a sickening crunch. The third assassin managed to slash Soren's arm, but the Alpha King barely flinched, delivering a devastating, open-handed strike to the man's chest that dropped him instantly. Petar backed away, his face pale with absolute horror. "Guards!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "The king has gone mad. To me!" Footsteps thundered up the spiraling staircase. But it wasn't Petar's loyalists who burst through the door. It was Qasim Rahman, the rival Alpha King, his curved scimitar drawn and dripping with blood. Behind him stood Ivana Stankovic, holding a heavy iron fireplace poker. Breathing heavily, Petar stared at them in shock. "Qasim, we had a deal. You were to take the southern borders." Qasim let out a low, dark chuckle, stepping into the room. "I am an opportunist, Petar, not a fool. You offered me land, but you asked me to betray an alpha. We beasts may fight over territory, but we do not ally with treacherous snakes who poison their own pack." He looked at Soren, nodding respectfully. "Your borders are secure, Bjornsson. The traitors in the hallway have been dealt with." Ivana stepped forward, her sharp eyes locking onto Petar. "You told me the king was dying of madness." She spat, her voice thick with disgust. "You tried to use my loyalty to the crown to crown yourself." Petar realized he was trapped. The benevolent father figure vanished entirely, replaced by a snarling, desperate cornered animal. He drew his own longsword, his eyes darting frantically. He saw the tapestry in the corner trembling. He knew Astrid was there. With a desperate cry, Petar lunged not at Soren, but toward the corner, aiming to take Astrid hostage. "No!" Soren roared. Astrid stumbled out from behind the tapestry, terrified, tripping over the heavy rug. Petar's sword arched downward, but a blur of motion intercepted him. Ivana swung the heavy iron poker, cracking Petar hard against the wrist, sending his sword clattering to the floor. Before Petar could recover, Soren was upon him. The Alpha King grabbed his former beta by the front of his tunic, lifting him bodily into the air. The rage radiating from Soren was a physical weight in the room. "You sought to rule the darkness, Petar," Soren snarled, his fangs fully descended. "Let us see how you fare in it." With a powerful heave, Soren threw Petar through the shattered window, out into the howling, freezing void of the winter storm. Silence descended on the ruined chamber, broken only by the howling wind and the heavy, ragged breathing of the Alpha King. Qasim sheathed his sword, giving a respectful bow before slipping out the door. Ivana dropped the iron poker. She looked at Astrid, who was trembling on the floor, gave her a curt, unreadable nod, and left the room to command the cleanup. Soren stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving. Slowly, the beast receded. He turned to look at Astrid. She wasn't looking at him with fear. She was looking at him with a profound, earth-shattering realization. He had torn his kingdom apart tonight, not for power, but to protect her. Soren crossed the room, dropping to his knees before her. He reached out, his massive, bloodied hands gently cupping her face. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough, stripped of all its royal command, leaving only the man beneath. "No," Astrid whispered, tears spilling over his thumbs. "I am safe." Soren pulled her to him, burying his face in the crook of her neck. "No woman survived my chambers," he murmured, his breath hot against her skin, "because I never allowed myself to feel anything but the ice. You fell asleep on a monster's chest, Astrid, and you woke the man." He pulled back, his golden eyes filled with a fierce, possessive, and deeply romantic fire. He leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that was desperate, consuming, and fiercely protective. Astrid kissed him back, her hands tangling in his dark hair, the last remnants of the fearful maid burning away in the fire of the Alpha King's embrace. The curse of Blackwood Castle was broken not by a blade, nor by royal blood, but by the quiet courage of a girl who dared to offer mercy in the dark. Soren Bjornsson remained a terrifying alpha to the world, a storm of ice and fury, but to Astrid Nygaard, he was the fire that kept the cold away. She rose from the ashes of a scullery maid to stand beside him, not as a captive, but as his equal, proving that even the most monstrous hearts can be tamed when someone is brave enough to simply listen to them beat. Thank you for reading. If this tense, atmospheric romance captivated you, please like, share this story with your friends, and subscribe for more thrilling, unpredictable tales of love and survival. Your support helps bring more of these worlds to life.